The neon sign of Murphy's all-night diner buzzed and flickered against the pre-dawn darkness, casting an eerie red glow across the empty parking lot. It was 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, population 3,200. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were hard to keep, and where trouble, when it came, echoed through the valley like thunder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the diner, the familiar sounds of late-night America played their quiet symphony, the hiss of the coffee machine, the low hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rumble of 18-wheelers rolling down the interstate like metal beasts hunting through the night. At the far corner booth, beneath a faded photograph of the town's founding fathers, sat a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains surrounding them. Axel Roadhawk. Morrison, president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, wrapped his weathered hands around a white ceramic mug that looked tiny in his grip. 53 years old, with silver threading through his black beard like mountain streams, and scars that mapped a lifetime of hard choices and harder consequences. The waitress approached his table with practiced steps, her white sneakers silent against the checkered linoleum floor. Sarah Chen, 26 years old, had been working the graveyard shift at Murphy's for 8 months now, saving every dollar she could scrape together. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform, a light blue dress with Murphy's embroidered over the pocket, had seen better days. But it was clean, pressed, and worn with the dignity of someone who understood that honest work, no matter how humble, was nothing to be ashamed of. Tonight, though, something was different. Her usual warm smile, the one that made truckers leave bigger tips and made lonely travelers feel a little less alone, was nowhere to be found. Instead, her face carried the hollow, haunted expression of someone who'd been running on nothing but fear and caffeine for too long. As she refilled Axel's cup, her hand trembled slightly, just enough for him to notice. Steam rose between them like secrets waiting to be told. That's when she did it quick as a whisper, smooth as a car dealer in Vegas. She slipped a folded napkin under his saucer and walked away without meeting his eyes. Before we dive deeper into this story, if you believe that real strength comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves, that courage isn't the absence of fear but action in spite of it, which is Rain J.O., and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes wear leather and ride machines built of steel and thunder, then take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because what happens next will remind you that brotherhood isn't just about blood. It's about standing up when standing up matters most. It's about being the shield between the innocent and the storm. Axel unfolded the napkin with the same careful precision he used when field stripping a motorcycle engine, slowly, deliberately, missing nothing. The handwriting was rushed, desperate, the kind of script that comes from shaking hands and a racing heart. Please help me. My ex put a tracker on my car. He knows everywhere I go, everything I do. He texts me things I said to customers. Describes what I'm wearing before I even get home. I'm scared to go to my apartment. I'm scared to stay here. I don't know who else to trust. Please. I've seen how people in town respect you. I have nowhere else to turn. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, not from his hands, which had been steady through firefights in Afghanistan and bar brawls in a dozen states, but from the rage building in his chest like a slow-burning fuse. He looked up at Sarah, who was now behind the counter, her back turned, shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. She was wiping down the same spot on the counter for the third time, her movements mechanical, distracted. Sarah Chen had moved to Cedar Falls 8 months ago with nothing but a suitcase, a beaten-up Honda Civic, and the kind of determination that comes from having no other choice. She'd fled from Denver, from a relationship that had started like a fairy tale and ended like a horror movie. Her ex-boyfriend, Derek Mathis, was a successful software engineer who'd seemed charming, protective, caring until the day she realized his protection had become a prison. It had started small, questions about where she'd been, who she'd talked to. Then it escalated, going through her phone, showing up at her work unexpectedly, isolating her from friends and family, with a skill that was almost artistic in its cruelty. By the time she understood what was happening, she was trapped in a web of manipulation and control that made escape seem impossible. The final straw had come 6 months ago when she'd found the tracking devices, one in her purse, one hidden in her car, one sewn into the lining of her favorite jacket. When she confronted him, Derek hadn't denied it. He'd smiled that cold, calculating smile she'd come to fear, and told her it was for her own safety. That someone like her needed someone like him to make the important decisions. That night, while he slept, she'd taken only what she could carry and disappeared into the Colorado darkness, driving until her gas tank was empty and her credit cards were maxed out. Cedar Falls wasn't a destination, it was just where she'd finally stopped running. For 6 months, she'd thought she was free. She'd changed her name, paid for everything in cash, avoided social media like it was radioactive. She'd felt safe in this small mountain town where the biggest drama was usually about the high school football team or who was dating whom. But Derek Mathis was nothing if not persistent. And he was very, very good at finding people who didn't want to be found. Axel Morrison had his own ghosts. Born in Detroit to a factory worker father and a nurse mother, he'd learned early that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who protected and those who preyed. His father had been the former, a union man who'd stand between his family and any threat, no matter how big. His mother had been a healer, someone who saw the good in people even when they couldn't see it in themselves. At 18, Axel had enlisted in the army, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer. He'd seen what men could do to each other when the rules of civilization fell away. But he'd also seen brotherhood in its purest form: soldiers who'd die before they'd leave a comrade behind, who'd share their last ration with a buddy, who understood that sometimes the only thing standing between order and chaos was a willingness to hold the line. When he'd returned home, the civilian world had felt strange, hollow. Jobs came and went. Relationships started and ended. It wasn't until he'd bought his first Harley, a beat-up 1983 Sportster, that took 6 months to restore, that he'd found his tribe again. The Iron Wolves weren't outlaws in the Hollywood sense. They were working men, veterans, fathers, and grandfathers who'd found in the rumble of their engines and the solidarity of their leather the brotherhood they'd lost when they'd hung up their uniforms. They ran toy drives for underprivileged kids, escorted funeral processions for fallen veterans, and provided security for local charity events. But their most important work was off the books, unofficial, the kind of help that couldn't be quantified in press releases or tax write-offs. When someone in their community was in trouble, real trouble, the kind the police couldn't or wouldn't handle, the Iron Wolves became a different kind of law enforcement. Axel had been president of the Cedar Falls chapter for 7 years, and in that time, he'd helped a dozen women escape abusive relationships, run off 3 drug dealers who tried to set up shop near the elementary school, and quietly resolved countless disputes that could have torn the small community apart. He didn't consider himself a hero. Heroes were the guys who hadn't made it back from Afghanistan, the single mothers working 2 jobs to keep their kids fed, the teachers who spent their own money on school supplies. He was just a man who'd learned that sometimes the difference between justice and injustice was whether someone was willing to stand up and do what was right, regardless of the cost. As Axel finished reading the note, his phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, but the area code was local. The message was simple: "Tell the pretty waitress I'm watching." His blood ran cold. He looked around the diner. It was empty, except for Sarah and an elderly trucker in the far booth who was focused on his eggs and hash browns. Through the large windows, he could see his Harley parked under the lone streetlight, chrome gleaming in the early morning darkness. But beyond that, the shadows could hide a dozen watching eyes. Sarah appeared beside his table again, coffee pot in hand, but her movements were jerky, nervous. When she reached for his cup, he gently caught her wrist. "Sit down," he said quietly. His voice was deep, gravelly from years of cigarettes he'd given up and orders he'd shouted over the noise of engines and gunfire. "Please." She hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Murphy himself was probably sleeping off another late night. Then she slid into the booth across from Axel, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "He found me 3 weeks ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "I thought I was safe here, I thought I'd finally gotten away from him. Tell me everything." The story came out in fragments, like broken glass catching light. Derek had started with subtle signs: a flower delivery to the diner with no card, a text message asking how her shift was going when she was certain no one in town had her number. Then the details had gotten more specific. He described her conversations with customers, mentioned things about her apartment that only someone watching could know. "Yesterday, I found this under my windshield wiper," she said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The message was printed in block letters. "You look beautiful when you sleep." Axel's jaw tightened. He'd seen this pattern before: predators who used technology and psychological manipulation to control their victims. It was cowardly, efficient, and devastatingly effective. "Have you called the police?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah's laugh was bitter, hollow. "I tried, back in Denver." Derek's smart. He never technically threatened me, never left evidence that couldn't be explained away. "The cops said they couldn't do anything unless he actually hurt me." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "By the time someone like Derek actually hurts you, it's usually too late." "What about here?" "Sheriff Morrison's a good man." Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, was a 20-year veteran of the Colorado State Patrol who'd retired to Cedar Falls to escape the politics of big city law enforcement. "I'm working here under a false name," Sarah admitted. "Fake social security number, fake references. If I go to the police, they'll want to know who I really am, and Derek has connections. He'll find me again." Axel understood. The system that was supposed to protect people like Sarah too often failed them. Restraining orders were just pieces of paper to men like Derek Mathis. Background checks and surveillance took time that victims didn't have. Sometimes, unofficial justice was the only justice available. "Show me your car," he said. Outside, the pre-dawn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the mountains. Sarah's Honda Civic looked tired, worn, but well-maintained, the car of someone who couldn't afford repairs but took care of what she had. Axel pulled a small flashlight from his jacket and began systematically searching the vehicle. He found the first tracker magnetic mounted inside the rear wheel well, sleek and professional looking. The second was smaller, harder to spot, tucked behind the rear license plate. The third was the most sophisticated, a cellular device wired into the car's electrical system, nearly invisible unless you knew what to look for. "Jesus," Sarah breathed as Axel laid the 3 devices on the hood of her car. "He's been watching me for weeks." "Longer than that," Axel said, examining the hardwired unit. "This one's been here for months. He's been tracking you since before you left Denver." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her escape, her new life, her sense of safety, all of it had been an illusion. Derek had been controlling the game from the beginning, letting her think she'd won just so he could take it all away when it suited him. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. Axel's phone buzzed again. Another text. "Touching my property is a mistake, old man." That's when he saw it, a dark sedan parked across the street, just far enough from the streetlights to obscure the driver. As he watched, the engine started, and the car began to move slowly down Main Street. "Get inside," Axel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed in dangerous situations. Now, back in the diner, Axel pulled out his phone and opened the group chat for the Iron Wolves officers. His message was simple. "Emergency. Murphy's Diner. Come now. All of you." Within minutes, the replies started rolling in. "On my way. Tank Road Captain. ETA 10 minutes. Ghost Sergeant at Arms. Rolling. Preacher. What do you need?" "Doc. Secretary." Sarah watched from behind the counter as Axel made his calls, her hands shaking as she gripped a coffee mug like a lifeline. In the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of motorcycle engines, not the high-pitched whine of sport bikes, but the deep, throaty rumble of American iron. Harleys. Big one. The first bike to arrive was Tank's, a massive road king that looked like it could plow through a brick wall without slowing down. William "Tank" Rodriguez was the club's road captain, a former Marine sergeant who'd done 2 tours in Iraq before coming home to run a successful auto repair shop. At 6'4" and 280 pounds, with arms like tree trunks and a shaved head that gleamed under the streetlights, Tank looked like exactly the kind of man you'd want on your side in a fight. Ghost rolled in next on a blacked-out street glide, followed by Preacher on a heritage Softail, and finally Doc on a touring bike that was older than most college students, but still ran like a dream. Each man moved with the deliberate precision of someone who'd learned to trust his brothers with his life. They gathered around Axel's table in the back corner of the diner, their leather cuts the vests that marked them as iron wolves creaking softly as they settled in. Sarah brought coffee without being asked, her hands steadier now that she wasn't alone. Axel explained the situation in military-style brevity. The ex-boyfriend, the trackers, the escalating surveillance, the implied threats. When he finished, the table was silent for a long moment. So we've got a tech-savvy predator with resources and a pattern of escalation. Doc summarized. Dr. James Fletcher was the club's treasurer and a retired Army medic who now worked as a physician's assistant at the Leiter local clinic. At 58, he was the intellectual of the group, the one who thought 3 moves ahead and considered consequences. Question is, how do we handle this without making things worse for the girl? Could take his toys away, Ghost suggested. Marcus, Ghost Thompson, was the club's sergeant-at-arms, a former Army Ranger who'd earned his road name by being able to move through hostile territory without making a sound. He was smaller than the others, only 5'9" and 170 pounds, but there was something in his pale blue eyes that made smart people nervous. Find him, explain the situation, make sure he understands the error of his ways. And if he doesn't listen? Preacher asked. Michael Preacher Davis was a former Army chaplain who'd found God in a foxhole in Afghanistan and never let him go. He was also the most dangerous man at the table when roused to anger, the kind of righteous fury that came from seeing innocence threatened. Men like this don't usually respond to reason. Tank cracked his knuckles, a sound like kindling snapping in a fire. Then, we make it simple for him. Leave town, or we make leaving town the least painful option available. Careful, Doc warned. This isn't some local punk dealing drugs behind the high school. Guy's got resources, technical skills. If we push too hard, he might escalate in ways we can't control. Axel listened to his brothers discuss the situation, weighing options, considering angles. This was how the Iron Wolves operated, not as a gang or a mob, but as a military unit. Everyone had a voice, everyone's expertise was valued. But in the end, the decision was his to make. His phone buzzed. Another text. Last chance. Send her outside, and nobody gets hurt. He's here, Axel said quietly, showing the message to his brothers. Close. Ghost was already moving, slipping out the back door of the diner with the fluid grace that had earned him his road name. Tank and Preacher positioned themselves, near the windows, casual but alert. Doc stayed with Sarah behind the counter, his medical bag always within reach. 2 minutes later, Ghost reappeared. Dark blue Lexus, Colorado plates, parked behind the hardware store. One occupant, male 30s, using some kind of telephoto camera setup. Professional-grade surveillance. Derek, Sarah whispered from behind the counter. That's his car. Axel stood, his decision made. Tank, Preacher, you're with me. Doc, stay with Sarah. Ghost, watch our 6. What are you going to do? Sarah asked, fear and hope warring in her voice. Axel's smile was grim but reassuring. We're going to have a conversation. Derek Mathis had always prided himself on being smarter than everyone around him. At 34, he was a senior software engineer for a Fortune 500 company, pulling down 6 figures designing security systems for corporate networks. He understood technology, psychology, human behavior. He knew how to find people who didn't want to give the wrong impression. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Derek said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. "But you're making a serious mistake. I'm a private citizen conducting legal surveillance in a public place. I know my rights." "Oh, you know your rights," Preacher said from behind the wheel, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd counseled dying soldiers and grieving families. "That's good. Do you know your wrongs?" Derek's confusion must have shown on his face because Axel continued. "See, Derek, we've been having a conversation with a young lady who used to know you, Sarah Chan. Ring any bells?" The color drained from Derek's face. "I don't know who you're talking about." Tank held up one of the tracking devices they'd removed from Sarah's car. "Recognize this? GPS tracker. Cellular-enabled real-time reporting. Funny thing, your fingerprints are all over it." "That's impossible. I never." "We also found the one you hardwired into her electrical system," Axel continued. "Professional job. Must have taken someone with your skills to install it. Course, that was back in Denver, wasn't it? Before she ran away from you the first time." Derek's carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "You can't prove anything. And even if you could, it's not illegal to stalk someone across state lines." Preacher interrupted. "To install surveillance devices on someone else's vehicle? To send threatening messages?" He held up Derek's own phone, which Ghost had somehow acquired. "Text message history's real interesting reading, Derek. Real romantic stuff. You can't hide from me. I'll always find you. You belong to me." Shakespeare would be impressed. "Here's what's going to happen," Axel said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "You're going to delete Sarah's number from your phone. You're going to destroy any photos you've taken of her. You're going to remove any tracking software you've installed. And then you're going to drive back to Denver and forget she ever existed. And if I don't?" Derek's voice cracked slightly. Tank smiled an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Derek, you seem like a smart guy. Smart enough to run a cost-benefit analysis. On one side, you've got an unhealthy obsession with a woman who doesn't want you. On the other side, you've got the rest of your life. Seems like a pretty easy choice. You can't threaten me. I'll call the police." You'll what?" Ghost appeared at the driver's side window, having materialized from the darkness like his road name suggested. "File a report? Explain to the nice police officers what you were doing with professional surveillance equipment outside a diner at 5 in the morning? Walk them through your collection of stalking photos? That's a bold strategy, Derek. Let's see how it works out for you." The silence stretched for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Derek's breathing was shallow, rapid. He was a predator who'd built his confidence on targeting isolated, vulnerable women. Facing down 4 combat veterans who'd chosen to make his problem their problem was outside his experience and expertise. "I want to leave," he finally whispered. "Outstanding choice," Axel said. "But first, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what leaving means." Preacher handed Derek his phone back. "Delete her number. Now." With shaking fingers, Derek navigated to his contacts and removed Sarah's information. "Photos," Tank prompted. Derek's photo gallery contained dozens of images of Sarah at work, coming and going from her apartment, shopping, walking. The digital diary of a months-long obsession. One by one, he deleted them. Cloud backup. Ghost added helpfully from outside the window. Derek closed his eyes, looking physically ill. Gone. Tracking software. More button presses, more deletions. The digital chains he'd forged to bind Sarah to his obsession disappearing one by one. "Now," Axel said, pulling out his own phone, "we're going to have a little insurance policy." Tank held Derek steady while Axel took photos. Derek's face, his license plate, his driver's license. "These are going into a very special file, Derek. Distributed to every member of every motorcycle club in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Your face, your name, your obsession. If Sarah so much as gets a wrong number phone call, if she finds so much as a flower on her doorstep, if she even has a bad feeling about someone following her, we're going to assume it's you. And next time, we won't be nearly this polite. I understand, Derek said, his voice barely audible. I hope you do, Preacher said, his chaplain's voice carrying the weight of moral authority. Because this is your moment, Derek. Your choice. You can drive away from here and get the help you need, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes to understand that love isn't ownership and women aren't property. Or you can ignore this conversation and discover that your technical skills don't mean much when you're dealing with men who've learned that some problems can't be solved with computers. They left Derek, sitting in his car, hands shaking, staring at his now empty phone. As they walked back toward the diner, Tank clapped Axel on the shoulder. Think he got the message? He got it, Ghost confirmed. Whether he follows through is another question. He will, Doc said as they rejoined him inside the diner. Men like that are bullies at heart. They fold when they meet real resistance. By the time the sun crested the mountains, Derek Mathis was gone, his Lexus disappearing down the interstate like a bad memory fading in daylight. The Iron Wolves had done a final sweep of Sarah's car and apartment, finding and removing 2 additional tracking devices that Derek had apparently planted during previous reconnaissance trips. Sarah sat in the corner booth where this had all started, cradling a cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. The fear that had been her constant companion for months was gone, replaced by something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what it was like. Safety. How do I thank you? She asked, as Axel slid into the booth across from her. You don't, he said simply. You live your life. You smile again. You trust again. That's thanks enough. But why? You don't even know me. Axel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains that had sheltered this small community for thousands of years. You ever hear the story of why we call ourselves the Iron Wolves? Sarah shook her head. Wolves are pack animals. They protect their own, but more than that, they protect their territory. Everything in it. Not just other wolves, but the rabbits, the deer, the whole ecosystem. Because they understand that strength doesn't mean anything if you don't use it to protect something worth protecting. He paused, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. We chose iron because it's strong, reliable, honest. You can trust iron to be what it says it is. And when good iron is properly forged, it lasts forever. I don't understand. This is our territory, Sarah. These mountains, this town, the people in it. You're part of that now, whether you knew it or not, and men like Derek Mathis, their pollution. They poison everything they touch, make good people afraid to live their lives. We can't allow that. Through the diner's windows, they could see Tank and Preacher performing a final security sweep of the parking lot while Ghost and Doc checked the perimeter. Professional, thorough, caring. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now you go home, get some sleep, and come back to work tomorrow night if you want to. Derek won't be bothering you anymore. How can you be sure? Axel's smile was grim but confident. Because we'll be watching. Not like he was, not controlling, not possessive, just aware. Making sure you're safe. It's what we do. Over the next few weeks, life in Cedar Falls settled into a new rhythm. Sarah's smile returned gradually, like a flower blooming after a hard winter. She started taking college classes online, planning for a future she'd been too afraid to imagine. She even went on a few dates with a local teacher, a quiet, kind man who understood that some people needed time and space to heal. The Iron Wolves kept their word. Their protection was invisible but absolute. They didn't hover or intrude, but somehow Sarah always knew they were there. Tank ate breakfast at the diner twice a week. Doc stopped by for coffee during his rounds. Preacher sometimes worked on his sermon notes at the corner table. Ghost she rarely saw, but she sometimes caught glimpses of him in her peripheral vision, a guardian angel in leather and denim. Derek Mathis never returned to Colorado. According to mutual friends in Denver, he'd sold his house, quit his job, and moved to Seattle. Some said he'd entered therapy. Others suggested he'd found someone new to obsess over. Sarah chose not to investigate. That chapter of her life was closed, and she had no desire to reread it. 3 months after that night at the diner, Sarah was approached by a young woman during her shift, maybe 19. Scared, sporting bruises that makeup couldn't quite hide. The girl slipped her a note, just like Sarah had done with Axel. Sarah read it, folded it carefully, and walked to the corner booth where Axel was finishing his usual late-night coffee. "We might have a problem," she said, placing the note on the table. Axel read it, his jaw tightening. "We'll handle it. I want to help." "Sarah, no, listen to me. I know what she's going through. I know the fear, the isolation, the feeling that nobody understands. Let me talk to her first. Help her understand that she's not alone." Axel studied her face, the strength that had grown from survival, the compassion that had bloomed from being shown compassion. "You sure about this?" "I'm sure. And if talking doesn't work," she gestured toward the parking lot, where the rumble of motorcycle engines could be heard, "well, we know where to find help." That night marked the beginning of something new in Cedar Falls. Sarah became the unofficial liaison between the Iron Wolves and the women who needed their help. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the flinching at sudden movements, the constant checking of phones, the hollow look that came from living in constant fear. The network grew quietly, organically, a safe house in Doc's basement, a job placement system that Tank coordinated through his auto shop, legal advice from Preacher's wife, who was a retired public defender, transportation provided by Ghost, who could move people from danger to safety without leaving a digital trail. They called it the Underground Railroad, a name that honored the historical precedent while acknowledging their modern mission. By the end of the year, they'd helped 17 women and 6 children escape abusive situations. Some stayed in Cedar Falls. Others moved on to distant cities where they could start over. All of them knew that somewhere in the Colorado mountains, a group of unlikely guardians stood ready to protect them. 2 years later, Sarah Chen, who'd legally changed her name back from the alias she'd been using, stood behind the counter of her own diner. Murphy had sold her the business when he decided to retire to Florida, and she'd renamed it Second Chances Cafe. The menu was the same, the coffee was still strong, and the hours still accommodated the needs of truckers, shift workers, and anyone else who needed a warm meal and a friendly face at odd hours. But there were changes. A bulletin board near the front door carried information about domestic violence resources, job training programs, and counseling services. The corner booth, Axel's booth, had a small plaque that read, "Reserved for Protectors." And in the back office, Sarah kept a secure phone that connected directly to a network of guardians throughout the Rocky Mountain West. The Iron Wolves still came by regularly, but now they were customers rather than protectors. Well, customers and protectors both. The distinction had blurred over time, as Sarah had learned that protection was less about dramatic rescues and more about creating a community where people looked out for each other. On this particular night, as snow fell softly outside and the coffee machine hissed its familiar rhythm, Sarah found herself thinking about the note she'd slipped to Axel that morning 2 years ago. Such a small thing, a folded napkin with a desperate plea written in shaking handwriting. But it had changed everything. The door chimed as Axel entered, shaking snow from his jacket. At 55, he moved a little slower than he had, but his eyes were still, sharp, still alert for threats and opportunities to help. "How's business?" he asked, settling into his usual booth. "Good," Sarah said, bringing him coffee without being asked. "Busy. Got a call yesterday from a shelter in Denver. They're referring people to us. The network's growing. It needs to. There are so many people out there who need help, who think they don't have options." Axel nodded, understanding. "You know what I think about when I see what this place has become?" "What?" "I think about that note you gave me. About how much courage it took to trust a stranger with your life. About how one act of faith can change everything." Sarah smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "You changed everything, Axel. You and your brothers. You showed me that there are still good people in the world. We all changed everything, Sarah. You, me, Tank, Doc, Ghost, Preacher, everyone who's ever walked through that door looking for help or offering it. That's how communities work. That's how the world gets better. One person helping another, one act of kindness at a time. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the small mountain town in pristine white. Inside the Second Chances Cafe, the work continued, coffee brewed, meals served, stories shared, lives quietly transformed. And in the corner booth, under the soft glow of vintage lighting, an unlikely protector and the woman he'd helped save planned the next chapter of their underground railroad. The Iron Wolves had learned something that night 2 years ago, something that every true warrior eventually discovers. The greatest victories aren't won on battlefields or in dramatic confrontations. They're won in quiet moments of courage, in decisions to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves, in the choice to use strength not for domination but for protection. And sometimes, those victories begin with nothing more than a folded napkin and the faith that someone, somewhere, will choose to help rather than look away. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that there are still guardians among us who believe in protecting the innocent and standing up for what's right, then take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Tell us in the comments about a time when someone unexpected stood up for you, or when you had the chance to be someone else's protector. And remember, brotherhood isn't about blood or patches or motorcycles. It's about the decision to care for others, to use whatever strength you have in service of something greater than yourself. It's about being the person who reads the note, who makes the call, who stands between the innocent and the storm. Write in the comments, "I believe in protectors," because in a world that sometimes feels dark and dangerous, it's important to remember that there are still people who've made protecting others their calling. They might wear leather, they might ride steel, horses, but their hearts are made of the same stuff that's always made heroes: compassion, courage, and an unshakable belief that everyone deserves to feel safe. Sometimes the angels we pray for come not with wings, but with engines that thunder through the night, carrying messages of hope to those who need it most. This story is dedicated to all the real-life protectors, law enforcement officers, social workers, shelter volunteers, and yes, motorcycle club members who use their strength to shield the vulnerable. To the survivors who found the courage to ask for help, and to the communities that choose to support them. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence or stalking, help is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. Second chances aren't just for fiction. They're real, they're available, and they're worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring, and thank you for being the kind of person who believes that everyone deserves protection, respect, and the chance to live without fear. Until next time, ride safe, love hard, and never stop standing up for what's right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.